Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we are stepping into a world that most of us were never taught existed. A world where modern humans were not alone, where at least 9 different kinds of human beings walk this earth together, breathing the same cold air, staring into the same firelight, crossing the same mountains, and perhaps wondering the very same thing we still wonder today. What does it truly mean to be human? For most of my life, I believed the story we were all told that humanity was simple, linear, almost inevitable. We evolved in Africa, spread across the planet, and replaced everything else cleanly, completely. But the deeper I began reading about ancient DNA and forgotten caves, broken skulls buried beneath stone and ice, the more that story started to collapse in front of me. Because the truth is far stranger and honestly, far more haunting. 40,000 years ago, if you walked across Europe or Asia, you may not have been alone. Somewhere beyond the next valley, another kind of human mind might have been watching the same sunset, making tools beside another fire, holding their children close during the long winter nights. Neanderthals, Denisovans, tiny island humans no taller than a child, ancient hunters whose names we still barely understand. Some of them painted caves, some buried their dead, some may have worn jewelry, and some, incredibly, still live on inside your body right now. That part is what I cannot stop thinking about, because this is no longer just a story about fossils or archaeology or extinct species. This is a story about us, about why some people today carry Neanderthal genes that affect pain, immunity, even the way the lungs respond to disease. Uh, about how the people of Tibet inherited the ability to survive high mountain air from another species of human that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. And maybe the strangest thought of all, what if humanity did not survive because we defeated the others? What if we survived because, in some way, we became them? The more I explored this subject, the more I started feeling something difficult to describe. Not fear exactly, not sadness either, but a strange kind of loneliness. Because for almost all of human history, we were never truly alone on this planet. There was always another kind of human somewhere beyond the horizon, another pair of eyes looking into the darkness, another mind trying to understand the world, another hand pressing itself against a cave wall and leaving behind the simple message, I was here. And now, only one remains. So tonight, I want to take you with me into that lost world, not as a lecture, not as a textbook, but as a journey through ancient caves, vanished bloodlines, forgotten species, and the unsettling possibility that echoes of all of them are still alive inside us. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes slowly. Let the world grow quiet around you. And together, let us travel back to a time when the earth did not belong to just one humanity, but many. I used to think human history was simple, not easy, but simple. There was something comforting about the version of the story we were all taught growing up, that somewhere deep in Africa, our species slowly emerged from the ancient world, became smarter, stronger, more adaptable, and then spread across the earth like an unstoppable tide, replacing everything else that came before us. It felt clean, almost elegant, as though evolution had always been moving toward us, toward Homo sapiens, toward the modern human mind sitting here tonight listening to this story. But a few years ago, I came across a sentence that completely shattered that illusion. It said, 100,000 years ago, at least 9 species of humans shared the earth. I remember staring at those words for a long moment, honestly unsure if I had misunderstood them. 9? Not 9 civilizations, not 9 tribes, 9 different kinds of humans living at the same time, breathing the same air, walking beneath the same beneath the same stars. And I could not stop thinking about it because nobody had ever told me that before. In school, history always felt lonely, as if humanity had walked through time alone from the very beginning. But suddenly, the world became crowded, ancient forests crowded, mountain valleys crowded, Ice Age plains crowded, not with animals, but with minds, with other versions of humanity, other eyes looking into firelight, other hands shaping tools from stone, other voices speaking languages forever lost to time. The more I read, the stranger it became. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans spread across enormous parts of Asia, tiny human species isolated on forgotten islands. Ancient populations with bodies and brains so different from ours that if you saw them standing at the edge of a forest at dusk, you might not know whether to approach them or run. And yet they were human, not metaphorically, literally. They made tools, cared for their children, survived brutal winters, crossed landscapes that would terrify most modern people. Some buried their dead, some painted caves, some may have worn jewelry, some may even have sung beside fires at night while storms moved across the dark horizon. And for some reason, that realization affected me far more deeply than I expected. Because once you truly understand it, once you allow yourself to imagine that ancient world clearly, it changes something fundamental inside you. Suddenly, humanity no longer feels like a straight line. It feels like a vanished ecosystem, an entire world of human minds, now gone. I think that was the moment I became obsessed with this subject, not because of fossils or archaeology or genetics, but because of what it implied about us, about who we are, and maybe who we used to be. Because if multiple kinds of humans existed at the same time, then the question changes completely. The question is no longer, where did we come from? The question becomes, why are we the only ones left? And honestly, I find that question haunting because for most of evolutionary history, being human did not mean being alone. Somewhere beyond the next mountain range, there was almost always another kind of person, similar but different, close enough to recognize, distant enough to feel unfamiliar. Imagine what that must have been like. Imagine standing beside a fire 70,000 years ago, hearing rumors from travelers about strange people beyond the valley, people broader than us, stronger than us, people whose faces looked almost human, but not entirely. Imagine seeing them for the first time. Imagine the silence between both groups, the curiosity, the fear, the recognition. Did they see themselves in each other? Did they know they were different species? Or did they simply think, those are another kind of people? I cannot stop wondering about moments like that because they happened. They truly happened. Not in mythology, not in fantasy, but here, on this earth, beneath the same moon we still look at today. And perhaps the strangest part of all is that they never entirely disappeared, because modern genetics has revealed something astonishing. Many of us still carry pieces of them inside our bodies right now. Tiny fragments of Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA, ancient inheritances passed silently across tens of thousands of years, surviving wars, migrations, empires, civilizations, until eventually reaching us here, tonight. Which means this story is not really about extinction, not entirely. It is about memory, biological memory, hidden beneath skin and bone, waiting for science to finally uncover it. And the deeper I go into this story, the more I feel a strange mixture of awe and sadness. Awe at how vast and mysterious human history truly is. And sadness because we arrived at the very end of it. We are the last human species left alive, the final survivors of a world that once contained many kinds of minds, many kinds of dreams, many kinds of people, and sometimes late at night. I wonder if some part of the loneliness modern humans feel, that deep sense of existential isolation that runs through our philosophy, our religion, our art, comes from the fact that for the first time in millions of years, there is nobody else here anymore. In the summer of 1856, long before ancient DNA, long before modern archaeology, long before anyone imagined that multiple kinds of humans once shared the earth, a group of quarry workers climbed into a small cave high above the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf, Germany. They were cutting limestone from the cliffs, just another ordinary day of hard labor in industrial Europe. Dust in the air, stone cracking beneath iron tools. The sound of men working without the slightest idea that history was about to change forever. Inside that cave, buried beneath layers of sediment and time, they found bones, strange bones, a skull cap, ribs, fragments of arms and legs, thick, heavy, oddly shaped. At first, the workers thought the remains belonged to a bear or some malformed animal. And honestly, that reaction says something important about human nature. Because when people encounter something that does not fit their understanding of the world, the first instinct is often not curiosity, but rejection. Fortunately, before the bones were discarded forever, a local schoolteacher named Johann Karl Fulrad was called to examine them. And this is the part of the story I cannot stop thinking about, because Fulrad looked at those bones and immediately understood that something was wrong. Or perhaps more accurately, something was astonishingly different. The skull was long and low, with enormous brow ridges projecting outward above the eyes. The limb bones were unusually thick and curved, unlike anything seen in modern human skeletons. Even without modern technology, even without genetics, even without evolutionary theory fully established, he sensed that these remains belonged to something ancient, something deeply human, and yet not entirely human in the way he understood it. Imagine that moment for a second. Imagine standing in a quiet room in 1856, holding the skull of another kind of person, another kind of humanity, a being who had walked this earth tens of thousands of years before you, before your civilization, before your religion, before recorded history itself. I think that realization must have felt almost unbearable. Fulrad brought the bones to Hermann Schaffhausen, a professor of anatomy at the University of Bonn. Together, they presented the remains to the scientific community. And what happened next reveals something profound about us, because the reaction was not wonder, not excitement, not fascination. It was hostility, denial, resistance. One of the most powerful scientists in Europe at the time, Rudolf Virchow, examined the bones and dismissed the entire idea. According to Virchow, these were not the remains of another human species. They belonged merely to a diseased modern man, perhaps someone suffering from rickets, arthritis, deformities caused by injury and illness. In other words, the bones were forced back into the old narrative because the alternative was too disturbing. And honestly, the more I studied this episode, the more I realized the argument was never only about anatomy. It was about identity, about the desperate human need to believe we are unique, special, singular. Because if another kind of human once existed, then suddenly humanity no longer feels separate from nature. We become part of a much stranger evolutionary story, a branching tree rather than a divine straight line. And 19th century Europe was not ready for that. Remember, this happened before Darwin published On the Origin of Species, before evolution itself had become accepted science. The idea that humans shared ancestry with other forms of life was already controversial enough, but the suggestion that another intelligent human species had once lived beside us, that was existentially terrifying. It challenged religion, philosophy, morality, even the emotional image humans carried of themselves. So for decades, much of the scientific establishment chose comfort over possibility. They preferred the explanation that preserved human uniqueness, even if the bones themselves quietly told another story. And this is what fascinates me most about the Neander Valley discovery. Not that scientists were wrong, science is wrong all the time. That is how it grows. What fascinates me is how deeply human beings resist ideas that make them feel less alone, or perhaps less important. Because the moment those bones emerged from the cave, they forced humanity to confront a terrifying possibility. Maybe we were never the only humans here. Maybe history was not a lonely road walked by one triumphant species, but a crowded landscape filled with different minds, different faces, different ways of being human. And somewhere beneath all of this, I think there is an emotional truth we rarely admit out loud, We want to believe we are exceptional. We want to believe the universe was somehow leading toward us, toward Homo sapiens, toward modern civilization. But the Neanderthal bones whispered something entirely different from the darkness of that cave. They whispered that humanity may not be a singular miracle, but one branch among many. One surviving thread in a vast and mostly forgotten tapestry of human existence. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is that those bones remained silent for tens of thousands of years, waiting patiently in the darkness, until one summer afternoon, when the earth finally decided to remind us that we were never alone. The more I read about the 19th century reaction to the Neanderthal discovery, the more I realized something unsettling. The bones themselves were not the real problem. The real problem was what the bones implied. Because if another kind of human had once existed, then the entire human story suddenly became unstable, uncertain, almost frightening in its implications. It is easy for us now, so living in the age of genetics and space telescopes and evolutionary biology, to look back and assume the evidence would have been exciting, revolutionary, welcomed, but it was not. In many ways, the discovery of Neanderthal was treated almost like an intrusion, an unwanted crack in the mirror humanity used to look at itself. And honestly, I think I understand why. Because for thousands of years, nearly every civilization built its identity around the assumption that human beings occupied a unique place in existence. Religions described humans as distinct from animals. Philosophy described reason as the dividing line between us and the rest of nature. Even early science quietly assumed that modern humanity stood alone at the center of its own story. Then suddenly, buried inside a cave in Germany, came evidence suggesting that we were not the only intelligent human beings to ever walk the earth. Imagine how destabilizing that must have felt, not just scientifically, emotionally, spiritually. If another kind of human once existed, then what exactly made us special? What separated Homo sapiens from the rest? Was intelligence enough? Tool-making, language, art, compassion? The deeper scientists looked, the blurrier the boundary became. And maybe that was the true horror hidden inside those ancient bones. Not that another species existed, but that they looked too much like us, close enough to recognize, close enough to disturb the categories people depended on. Because human beings are comfortable with extremes. We understand human and animal, civilized and wild, us and other. But Neanderthal existed in the uncomfortable middle space, almost human, perhaps painfully human, and that ambiguity terrified people. I remember sitting alone one night reading old scientific reactions to Neanderthal fossils, and what struck me most was how emotional the language often became. Scientists were not merely debating anatomy, they were defending an idea of humanity itself. Many of them desperately wanted Neanderthals to be diseased humans, malformed humans, anything except another branch of humanity. Because once you accept that another human species existed, 1,000 uncomfortable questions immediately follow. Did they love? Did they grieve? Did they pray? Did they dream? And perhaps the hardest question of all, if they were human too, why are they gone while we survived? I think this is the moment when my own understanding of human history truly began to change because I realized that the old story we inherited, the simple story, was never really about evidence. It was about comfort. We wanted history to feel linear, inevitable, meaningful. We wanted to believe humanity was always moving upward toward us, toward modern civilization, toward cities and technology and the world we know now. But evolution does not work like that. Nature does not create straight lines. It creates experiments, branches, dead ends, survivals, disappearances. And suddenly, when I looked at the human past through that lens, everything felt different. Prehistory no longer looked empty. It looked crowded, ancient Europe crowded with Neanderthals, Asia filled with Denisovans, isolated islands inhabited by strange small-bodied humans, archaic populations surviving in valleys and forests, while our ancestors moved slowly across the world. It stopped feeling like a story about one species conquering the earth and started feeling more like the fading memory of an entire lost ecosystem of human minds. That realization stayed with me because it changed the way I think about ourselves today. We often talk about humanity as though it has always been unified, singular, one continuous people stretching back into the distant past. But maybe that has only been true for a very short period of time. Maybe the deep history of humanity was never singular at all. Maybe for most of our existence, encountering another kind of human was completely normal. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another face, another language, another intelligence, similar, but not identical. And the more I imagine that ancient world, the stranger our modern loneliness begins to feel. Because we are now the only human species left, the last surviving branch, the final voice still speaking after all the others fell silent. But there must have been a time, tens of thousands of years ago, when a Homo sapiens child looked across a valley and saw another kind of person staring back. And I cannot help wondering what they felt in that moment. Fear, curiosity, recognition? Did they see monsters, rivals, or something much more disturbing, something almost familiar? Because maybe the true reason 19th century scientists resisted the existence of Neanderthals so fiercely is that deep down they sensed what those bones were really telling us, that humanity is not as unique, as separate, or as alone as we desperately want to believe. Um, in 2008, deep in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, archaeologists working inside a cold limestone cave made a discovery so small, so visually insignificant, that in another century it might have been forgotten forever. The cave itself was already known to researchers. Denisova Cave, a dark chamber hidden among forests and frozen hills, a place where ancient humans had come and gone for tens of thousands of years. Stone tools had been found there, traces of fires, fragments of old lives scattered quietly beneath the earth. But what the archaeologists uncovered that year did not look extraordinary. It was not a skull, not a skeleton, not even a complete bone, only a tiny fragment from the tip of a little finger, barely larger than a child's fingernail. And somehow, that tiny piece of bone would completely transform the human story. I remember the first time I learned about this discovery, and honestly, it felt almost unreal because for more than a century, paleoanthropology had depended on shape, on visible anatomy. Scientists compared skulls, jaws, teeth, brow ridges, trying to reconstruct entire species from fragments of bone and stone. Human history was something you could hold in your hands, measure with calipers, photograph beneath museum lights. But Denisova changed all of that because the tiny finger bone was too fragmentary to reveal much through anatomy alone. To the naked eye, it looked almost ordinary. Yet inside it, hidden in microscopic traces preserved across unimaginable spans of time, remained something revolutionary, ancient DNA. And this is where another figure enters the story, a scientist whose work now feels almost mythic to me, Svante Pääbo, a Swedish geneticist who dedicated much of his life to an idea many people once believed impossible, recovering the genetic code of beings who had been dead for tens of thousands of years. Think about that for a moment. There is something almost supernatural about it. Extracting biological memory from ancient bones, reading the faded instructions written inside cells long after the bodies themselves turned to dust. It feels less like archaeology and more like listening to ghosts. Pabo and his team at the Max Planck Institute had spent years developing techniques to isolate ancient DNA without contamination, a process so delicate that even a modern human breath inside the laboratory could compromise the results. When the Denisova fingerbone arrived for analysis, researchers expected one thing: Neanderthal. That would already have been important. Denisova Cave had shown evidence of Neanderthal occupation before, but what emerged from the sequencing stunned the scientific world. The DNA did not match Homo sapiens, and it did not match Neanderthal either. It belonged to something else entirely, another branch of humanity, another human lineage nobody had ever identified before. a species discovered not through skulls or skeletons, but through pure genetic information. And honestly, the more I think about this moment, the stranger it becomes, because an entire species of human beings, beings who lived, hunted, loved, survived, disappeared from the world, remained completely invisible to science until a tiny fragment of a child's finger revealed their existence. That realization still gives me chills. It means human history may contain entire chapters we still know nothing about. Entire peoples erased so completely that only faint traces of DNA remain buried inside caves and inside us. The newly discovered humans were named Denisovans, after the cave where the bone had been found. And at first, that was almost all researchers had: one finger bone, later a few teeth, almost nothing physical at all. Yet from those microscopic genetic traces, scientists began reconstructing an astonishing picture. The Denisovans were not a small, isolated tribe. They spread across vast regions of Asia. They interbred with our ancestors, and pieces of their DNA still survive in modern populations today, especially among the indigenous peoples of Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, parts of Southeast Asia. Even more astonishing, modern Tibetans inherited a Denisovan gene variant that allows them to survive in high-altitude environments with thin oxygen levels. A vanished species still helping humans breathe atop the roof of the world. Sometimes I stop and think about how unbelievable that sounds. A human species no one knew existed, silently shaping the biology of living people tens of thousands of years after disappearing. And perhaps that is the moment my understanding of history changed permanently. Because until I learned about Denisova, I still unconsciously imagined the past as something mostly recoverable, difficult, incomplete, but understandable. But Denisova revealed something far more unsettling. Human history is not simply buried. Parts of it are missing entirely, erased so deeply that only modern genetics can detect the echoes. We built entire narratives about who we are, where we came from, why we survived, while completely unaware that another human lineage had once shared this planet beside us. And if Denisovans remained hidden until 2010, discovered from a fragment no larger than a child's fingertip, then what else have we missed? How many human stories vanished without leaving enough bone behind to tell them? How many ancient encounters, ancient migrations, ancient loves disappeared into silence long before recorded history began? The deeper I explored this subject, the more I felt a strange kind of humility because it became impossible to escape one terrifying possibility. Maybe we have never truly understood the history of our own species. Maybe the story we inherited was not merely incomplete. Maybe it was only the smallest visible fragment of something vastly older, stranger, and more crowded than we ever imagined. For most of my life, whenever I heard the word Neanderthal, a very specific image appeared in my mind. A heavy-browed creature wrapped in animal skins, dragging itself through snow and darkness, grunting instead of speaking, violent, primitive, almost human, but not quite. I think many of us inherited that image without ever questioning where it came from. Cartoons, documentaries, old textbooks, Hollywood films, they all repeated the same idea over and over again. Neanderthals were the failures, the evolutionary dead ends, the clumsy cousins who could not keep up with the brilliance of Homo sapiens. And honestly, I believed it too. I never stopped to wonder whether the story itself might be wrong, because the stereotype felt convenient, comforting even. It allowed modern humans to see ourselves as the obvious winners of evolution, the intelligent species destined to inherit the Earth, while Neanderthals became a cautionary tale, proof that strength without intelligence eventually disappears. But the deeper I began reading about them, the more that image started collapsing, slowly at first and then all at once, because nearly everything I thought I knew about Neanderthals turned out to be distorted, oversimplified, or completely false. And I think that realization disturbed me more than I expected, because it forced me to confront how easily humans create myths about those who came before us, especially when those beings are close enough to resemble us. There is something deeply uncomfortable about another kind of human that was intelligent, emotional, creative, and yet vanished from the world. It is somehow easier to reduce them into caricatures, to imagine them as stupid brutes, because the alternative is much harder to face. The alternative is that they were people, not exactly like us, but close enough that the boundary becomes difficult to define. I remember seeing one reconstruction of a Neanderthal woman created by modern forensic artists, and for a moment, I genuinely forgot I was looking at an extinct species. Her eyes looked tired, thoughtful, almost familiar. She did not look like a monster from prehistory. She looked like someone you might pass on a train without noticing. And that image stayed with me because suddenly the entire emotional distance between us and them began to disappear. The old Hollywood version of Neanderthals was built around a simple assumption that intelligence moves upward in a straight line, primitive to advanced, ape to human, cave dweller to civilization. But real evolution is rarely that neat, and Neanderthals did not fit the role assigned to them. In fact, the evidence increasingly suggests something astonishing. Neanderthals were not cognitively inferior in the simplistic way we once imagined. Their brains were actually slightly larger on average than ours. Their bodies were powerfully adapted for Ice Age Europe. They survived brutal climates that would kill most modern humans without technology, generation after generation, for hundreds of thousands of years. Think about what that really means. Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 300,000 years. Neanderthals survived for nearly as long across some of the harshest environments on Earth. This was not a failed species. A failed species. This was one of the most successful human lineages in evolutionary history. And yet, somewhere along the way, modern culture transformed them into symbols of stupidity. Even today, people still use Neanderthal as an insult, meaning uncivilized, brutish, unintelligent, which honestly feels tragic to me now, because the real Neanderthals were probably far more complex than the myth we created around them. And maybe that myth reveals more about us than it does about them, because human beings have always defined themselves by comparison. We need an other to reinforce who we think we are. Ancient civilizations did it, nations do it, religions do it, and perhaps Homo sapiens did it too. Maybe turning Neanderthals into primitive creatures helped modern humans maintain the comforting belief that we are uniquely intelligent, uniquely advanced, uniquely deserving of survival. But once you begin examining the archaeological evidence carefully, that illusion becomes difficult to maintain because Neanderthals were making tools, controlling fire, hunting cooperatively, surviving enormous environmental changes long before our ancestors arrived in Europe. They were not mindless animals wandering frozen landscapes. They were another kind of humanity, another way of being human. And the more I realized that, the stranger the entire human story began to feel. Because if Neanderthals were not stupid, if they were not merely primitive brutes, then their extinction becomes far more haunting. It means another intelligent human species once looked out across this world, saw mountains and rivers and storms and stars, felt fear, hunger, attachment, perhaps even wonder, and then disappeared forever, or almost forever. Because now we know something else too, something that completely changes the emotional weight of this story. They did not vanish entirely. Some part of them still survives inside us. Their DNA still moves quietly through billions of living human bodies, affecting immunity, skin, even aspects of neurological function, which means that when we mocked Neanderthals for being primitive, we were unknowingly mocking our own ancestors, our own blood, our own forgotten reflections staring back at us across 40,000 years of silence. There is one discovery about Neanderthals that I cannot stop thinking about. Not because it is dramatic, not because it involves weapons or extinction or ancient mysteries, but because it feels painfully human. The discovery was made in Shanidar Cave, deep in the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iraqi Kurdistan, a place of stone and silence where generations of Neanderthals once sheltered from the cold winds of the Ice Age. Archaeologists excavating the cave in the 1950s uncovered the remains of several Neanderthal individuals, but one of them in particular changed the way scientists understood these ancient humans forever. He became known as Shanadar 1. And the more I learned about him, the harder it became to see Neanderthals as primitive creatures, because Shanadar 1 should not have survived, not in the brutal world he lived in, not according to the logic of pure survival. His skeleton told an extraordinary story of suffering. At some point in his life, probably long before adulthood, he experienced a crushing injury to the left side of his skull, severe enough to blind him in one eye. His right arm had withered dramatically, perhaps from paralysis, perhaps from injury. The lower part of the arm and hand were either missing entirely or permanently unusable. He also suffered damage to his leg, meaning he likely walked with difficulty. Imagine what that means in an Ice Age environment. A world without medicine, without agriculture, without permanent shelter. Survival depended on movement, hunting, carrying wood, enduring freezing winters. A severely disabled individual should not have lasted long, and yet Shanadar 1 survived into middle age, possibly 40 or even 50 years old, which for that period was remarkable. And there is only one explanation for that. Other Neanderthals cared for him. They fed him, protected him, slowed down for him, made room for him inside the group for years, perhaps decades. I remember reading that for the first time and feeling something shift inside me, because suddenly Neanderthals no longer felt distant. They no longer seemed like creatures separated from us by an unbridgeable evolutionary gap. They felt familiar, deeply familiar. Because compassion, real compassion, is expensive, especially in a harsh world. To care for someone who cannot fully contribute to survival requires something beyond instinct. It requires emotional attachment, memory, patience, maybe even love. And honestly, I think that realization changes everything. Because for generations, we imagined Neanderthals as violent creatures driven only by immediate survival. But Shanadar 1 suggests something very different. He suggests community, empathy, perhaps even mourning. He suggests that somewhere inside those ancient caves, beneath animal hides and firelight, another kind of human being was making the same difficult choice humans still make today to keep vulnerable people alive, even when it costs something. And then there is another haunting detail from Shanadar Cave, one that scientists still debate to this day. Another Neanderthal burial, known as Shanadar 4, was surrounded by unusual concentrations of pollen from wildflowers. Archaeologist Ralph Selecki proposed that the flowers had been deliberately placed with the body during burial, perhaps as part of a ritual, perhaps as an act of remembrance. The interpretation remains controversial. Some researchers argue the pollen may have been carried into the cave naturally by wind or burrowing animals. And yet, even with the debate unresolved, the emotional power of the possibility remains. Because imagine that scene for a moment. A group of Neanderthals standing quietly in the darkness of a cave, laying flowers beside the body of someone they lost. It sounds almost impossibly modern, almost unbearably human. And maybe that is why these discoveries affected me so deeply, because they force us to confront an uncomfortable possibility that emotional complexity, grief, attachment, tenderness may not belong exclusively to Homo sapiens. We often treat compassion as proof of our uniqueness. But what if compassion existed long before us? What if another kind of human once held their dying companions beside a fire while winter storms moved across the mountains outside? What if another species buried their dead because they too felt the terrible weight of loss? The more I think about Shanadar Cave, the stranger the human story becomes, because this is not merely archaeology anymore. This is evidence of emotional lives and invisible worlds of feeling preserved only indirectly through bone and earth. We will never know what language Neanderthals spoke, if they sang, if they prayed, if they told stories to children while snow fell outside their shelters. But Shanadar 1 tells us something undeniable. They cared for one another. And honestly, That single fact may matter more than almost anything else we have discovered about them. Because when we strip humanity down to its deepest core, beneath technology, beneath civilization, beneath language itself, what remains may simply be this: the ability to suffer with others, to protect the weak, to mourn the dead, to refuse to abandon one another, even in a brutal world. And if Neanderthals did those things too, then perhaps the line separating them from us was never as clear as we once believed. Perhaps tens of thousands of years ago, in cold caves lit by flickering firelight, another kind of human being loved each other in ways we would still recognize today. There is a moment in almost every documentary about ancient humans where the story becomes less about survival and more about meaning. For me, that moment arrived when I started reading about the cave paintings in Spain, because up until then, some part of me still held on to the old assumption that Neanderthals were intelligent in a practical sense, capable hunters, adaptable survivors, but perhaps lacking the deeper symbolic imagination that defines modern humanity. Art, after all, feels different from survival. You do not paint cave walls because you are hungry. You do not decorate objects because you need warmth. Art exists in that strange space beyond necessity. It is one of the clearest signs that a mind is trying to express something invisible: identity, memory, beauty, grief, belief. And for a very long time, scientists believed symbolic art belonged exclusively to Homo sapiens. It was treated almost like proof of our uniqueness, the moment consciousness became fully human. But then came the discoveries in Spain, deep inside caves where darkness has remained almost untouched for tens of thousands of years. Researchers using uranium-thorium dating techniques analyzed markings inside caves such as La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardalis. What they found stunned the scientific world. Some of the paintings and hand stencils were over 65,000 years old, older than the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe, which meant the artists could not have been modern humans. They were Neanderthals. And honestly, I still remember the feeling I had reading that, because suddenly the image of Neanderthals changed completely inside my mind. No longer just hunters surviving cold landscapes, but beings standing deep underground with flickering firelight beside them, pressing their hands against cave walls, blowing pigment across stone, leaving marks that would survive for 65,000 years. Think about that for a second. Think about that for a second. A Neanderthal hand against a cave wall. Uh, Someone choosing to say, "I was here." That gesture feels so profoundly human that it almost hurts. Because the moment a being begins leaving symbols behind, the moment they create something not strictly necessary for survival, they reveal an inner world, imagination, reflection, perhaps even longing. And the cave paintings were not the only evidence. Across Europe, archaeologists began finding more and more traces of symbolic behavior connected to Neanderthals. Eagle talons discovered in Croatia showed cut marks and wear patterns, suggesting they had been collected and strung together as ornaments, not tools, not food ornaments. Eagles are dangerous creatures, difficult to hunt. Their claws have no practical survival value, which means Neanderthals wanted them for another reason. Perhaps beauty, status, symbolism, maybe even spirituality. I find that detail strangely moving, because it is so familiar. Across cultures and across time, humans have always transformed objects into symbols: feathers, shells, bones, jewelry. We decorate ourselves not because it helps us survive, but because we want to express identity, memory, belonging. And suddenly, Neanderthals were doing the same thing. Then there was ochre, red iron pigment found at multiple Neanderthal sites, sometimes ground into powder, sometimes mixed and prepared carefully. We still debate exactly how they used it: body decoration, rituals, symbolic marking. But once again, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. These were not creatures concerned only with food and shelter. These were beings interacting with color, texture, appearance, meaning. And perhaps the most important realization of all is that none of this was necessary. That is what keeps haunting me. Neanderthals survived brutal ice age climates. They hunted massive animals, endured starvation, injury, freezing winters. Yet, even inside that harsh existence, they still made room for beauty, for symbols, for leaving traces behind. And maybe that tells us something profound about intelligence itself. We often define intelligence in terms of technology, efficiency, domination over nature. But perhaps one of the deepest signs of consciousness is something much quieter: the desire to leave a mark, the refusal to vanish completely into time. Because art is ultimately an act of defiance against disappearance. A handprint on a cave wall says something very simple: I existed. I saw this world. I was alive. And that realization changed the way I think about Neanderthals forever. Because for generations, we imagine them as beings trapped in pure survival. But the archaeological evidence increasingly suggests something else entirely. They were not only surviving, they were reflecting, expressing, remembering, perhaps even wondering about themselves in ways we still recognize. Sometimes I try to imagine those caves as they truly were, not silent museum sites, but living places. Fire crackling in darkness, shadows moving along stone walls, pigment staining ancient fingers, children watching adults press symbols onto rock surfaces while stories echoed through the chamber. And somewhere in that darkness, another kind of human mind looked at the world and felt the urge to create, not because survival demanded it, but because existence itself demanded expression. And honestly, I think that may be one of the most human things imaginable, because long before cities, long before writing, long before civilization, another species of humans stood underground in the flickering dark and chose to leave something behind: not food, not tools, but memory. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals survived across Europe and Western Asia through brutal winters, shifting climates, advancing glaciers. They hunted enormous ice age animals, adapted to landscapes of cold forests and frozen plains, buried their dead, made tools, created art, and endured for a span of time so immense that modern human civilization feels tiny beside it. And then, sometime around 40,000 years ago, they disappeared. Their camps grew silent, their fires went out, their bones vanished from the archaeological record. And ever since scientists first accepted Neanderthals as real, humanity has been haunted by one enormous question: what happened to them? At first, the answer seemed simple. Homo sapiens arrived. Neanderthals lost. Extinction followed. That was the old narrative. Clean, brutal, easy to understand. But the deeper researchers explored the evidence, the more complicated the story became, because extinction rarely happens in a single dramatic moment, especially not across entire continents. Instead, the disappearance of Neanderthals appears to have unfolded slowly, unevenly, over thousands of years, almost like the fading of a shadow at dusk. One possibility is competition. And honestly, this explanation still feels disturbingly plausible. When Homo sapiens entered Europe, they may have possessed small but critical advantages: slightly larger social networks, more flexible communication, faster innovation, better long-distance cooperation, not overwhelming superiority, just small edges repeated over generations. And evolution does not require dramatic victories. Sometimes survival comes down to tiny differences accumulated across centuries: a slightly better hunting strategy, a slightly larger alliance, a slightly more efficient exchange of information about food or shelter. Over enough time, those small advantages can reshape the fate of entire populations. I try to imagine what that must have looked like. Not epic battles, but slow displacement. Valleys becoming crowded, hunting grounds shrinking, resources growing scarcer. Neanderthals watching unfamiliar humans spread gradually across landscapes they had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. Another possibility is disease, and this theory becomes even more haunting when you compare it to more recent human history. Whenever isolated populations meet, invisible biological worlds collide with them. Pathogens harmless to one group can devastate another. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, disease killed millions of indigenous people, with horrifying speed. And perhaps something similar happened when Homo sapiens entered Neanderthal territory. Our ancestors carried microbes and pathogens that Neanderthals had never encountered before. Their immune systems, shaped separately over hundreds of thousands of years, may simply have been unprepared. It is chilling to imagine. Entire populations weakened, not by war, but by invisible particles moving quietly through breath and touch. But then there is the third explanation, the one that changed everything, because modern genetics revealed something nobody expected. Neanderthals did not simply compete with Homo sapiens. They interbred with us, they had children with us, and those children survived. For decades, this idea would have sounded almost impossible, another species of human reproducing with our ancestors. But today, the evidence is overwhelming. If your ancestry comes from Europe, Asia, or much of the world outside sub-Saharan Africa, approximately 2% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. 2% sounds small, but it is not. Spread across billions of people, fragments of Neanderthal biology still exist everywhere, inside immune systems, skin, hair, metabolism, even neurological function. Some Neanderthal genes appear to help modern humans adapt to colder climates. Others influence immune response. Some may even affect mood and pain perception, which means the extinction story becomes much stranger than we once imagined, because if Neanderthal DNA still survives in us, then in a biological sense, they never completely vanished. And honestly, that realization affected me more deeply than I expected. Because suddenly extinction no longer felt absolute, it became blurred, intimate, almost tragic in a different way. Imagine those encounters tens of thousands of years ago. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals meeting somewhere in the Middle East or Europe, perhaps cautiously at first, perhaps violently sometimes, but not always. Somewhere beneath Ice Age skies, members of two human species formed bonds strong enough to create families. And now, tens of thousands of years later, traces of those encounters still live inside our bodies. I think that changes the emotional meaning of the entire story, because we often imagine extinct species as completely gone, sealed away in museums and fossils. But Neanderthals are not entirely gone. Their populations disappeared, their languages vanished, their cultures dissolved into silence. Yet pieces of them continue moving quietly through living human beings all over the world. There is something profoundly haunting about that. A Neanderthal mother who lived 45,000 years ago, whose name we will never know, may still have descendants alive today, breathing, laughing, suffering, dreaming, carrying microscopic echoes of her existence inside every cell. And perhaps this is why the old replacement narrative no longer feels sufficient to me. It is too simple, too clean. The reality appears far more human, more tangled, more emotional. We did not merely destroy them, we merged with them. We absorbed fragments of their existence into ourselves. The boundary between us and them became porous, uncertain, almost impossible to define completely. And maybe that is the strangest truth hidden inside this entire story. The Neanderthals may not have vanished in the way we usually imagine extinction. Maybe they simply stopped existing as a separate people, because over time they became part of us. Their fires went dark, their voices disappeared, their species dissolved, but something of them survived the crossing of thousands of generations, quietly waiting inside modern humanity. So perhaps the real ending to the Neanderthal story is not extinction, but transformation. Perhaps they did not entirely disappear. Perhaps they simply became another layer of what it means to be human. There is something deeply unsettling about the Denisovans, not because they were violent or monstrous or dramatically different from us, but because for almost all of modern history, we had absolutely no idea they existed. Think about that for a moment. An entire branch of humanity spread across enormous parts of Asia, surviving for hundreds of thousands of years, meeting our ancestors, interbreeding with them, shaping the biology of millions of living people today, and yet leaving behind almost no visible trace of themselves, no great skeletons displayed in museums, No famous cave paintings attributed to them. No legends, no names, only faint genetic echoes hidden inside blood and bone. Sometimes I think the Denisovans are less like an extinct species and more like ghosts moving silently beneath human history, invisible until modern science accidentally uncovered them. When researchers first sequenced Denisovan DNA from that tiny finger bone in Siberia, they initially imagined a relatively isolated population, perhaps a small group living in the cold mountain regions around Denisova Cave. But then, something extraordinary happened. Scientists began comparing Denisovan genetic signatures with modern populations across the world, and the results completely shattered the original assumptions. The Denisovans were not confined to one cave or one region. Their DNA appeared across vast stretches of Asia and Oceania, especially among the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea, where as much as 4 to 6% of the genome in some populations comes from Denisovan ancestry. 4 to 6%. That is not a tiny accidental trace. That is the biological memory of repeated contact, repeated interbreeding, repeated encounters between ancient humans over enormous spans of time. And honestly, this was the moment when the Denisovan story stopped feeling like archaeology to me and started feeling almost mythological, because suddenly, hidden behind the modern map of Asia, another world began to emerge. Um, a lost world populated by human groups we never knew existed, stretching from Siberian mountains to tropical islands, moving through forests, coastlines, valleys, and monsoon landscapes long before recorded history began. The more researchers looked, the stranger the picture became. Denisovan DNA appeared not only in Papua New Guinea, but also in Aboriginal Australian populations, some Southeast Asian populations, Polynesian groups, even traces among indigenous peoples of the Americas. Which means the Denisovans were not a single isolated tribe. They were widespread, adaptable, successful, possibly divided into multiple populations separated across enormous geographic distances. Some geneticists now believe Denisovan groups may have been as genetically diverse from one another as modern Europeans are from modern Africans today. Just pause and imagine what that implies. There may not have been one Denisovan population, but many entire branches of humanity spreading across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, leaving almost no physical evidence behind. It feels almost impossible, an invisible empire of human beings erased so thoroughly that only DNA remembers them. And I think that is the part of this story that affects me most deeply, because it completely changes how I imagine the ancient world. I used to think prehistory was mostly empty, scattered tribes surviving in isolation. But now, when I picture Ice Age Asia, I see something entirely different. I see migration routes crossing forests and coastlines, multiple human species occupying overlapping territories, encounters beneath unfamiliar stars, ancient strangers meeting at river crossings, perhaps trading, perhaps fearing one another, perhaps falling in love. Somewhere tens of thousands of years ago, a Denisovan person and Homo sapiens person stood close enough together for their descendants to survive all the way into the modern world. That thought honestly leaves me speechless sometimes, because these encounters were not symbolic. They were real, biological, intimate. The people alive today in parts of Oceania and Southeast Asia literally carry the evidence of those meetings inside their cells. And what makes the Denisovan story even more haunting is how little we still know about them. We do not know what they looked like with certainty. We do not know their languages, their rituals, their beliefs, their songs. We have fragments, teeth, bones, DNA, shadows. That is all. And yet, despite that absence, their presence feels enormous, almost overwhelming, because they reveal something terrifying about history itself. Entire human worlds can disappear almost completely, cultures, populations, identities, all gone, until only faint molecular traces remain buried inside future generations. Sometimes I wonder how many other forgotten human lineages once existed across Earth, populations we have not discovered yet because their bones dissolved, their caves collapsed, their names vanished before language could preserve them. The Denisovans remind us that human history is not merely incomplete. It may be fundamentally hidden from us in ways we are only beginning to understand. And maybe that is why this story feels so emotionally powerful to me, because it forces us to confront how fragile memory really is. Not just personal memory, but species memory. Civilization often behaves as though humanity fully understands its own origins, but the Denisovans prove otherwise. We are still uncovering entire branches of ourselves buried beneath mountains and encoded silently within living DNA. There is something almost poetic about that. The Denisovans disappeared tens of thousands of years ago, and yet, without realizing it, millions of people have carried their legacy quietly through every century since, through migrations, empires, wars, religions, modern cities, all the way to the present moment. Like ghosts hidden inside the bloodstream of humanity, waiting patiently for science to finally recognize that they had been here all along. There are certain discoveries in science that feel less like data and more like whispers from another world. And for me, one of the most haunting began not in a laboratory, but on the Tibetan Plateau, a place so high and unforgiving that even modern humans struggle to survive there without generations of adaptation. The air is thin, the cold relentless, the landscape vast and almost unreal, often called the roof of the world. Tibet rises so high above sea level that the human body begins to fail there. Oxygen becomes scarce, breathing grows difficult, blood thickens dangerously as the body struggles to compensate. For most people, prolonged exposure at those altitudes can become deadly. And yet, Tibetan populations have lived there successfully for thousands of years, not merely surviving, but thriving. For a long time, scientists wondered how, because the Tibetan adaptation to altitude is extraordinary. Their bodies respond differently to low oxygen levels compared to most humans, instead of overproducing red blood cells, which can lead to dangerous complications. Tibetan physiology remains balanced, efficient, almost uniquely suited to life above the clouds. Then, researchers made a discovery that completely changed the story. Hidden inside the genomes of Tibetan populations was a specific gene variant known as EPA-S1, a variant strongly associated with high altitude adaptation. But when scientists traced the evolutionary origin of this gene, they found something astonishing. It did not come from ordinary Homo sapiens ancestry. The gene came from Denisovans. And honestly, when I first learned this, I had to stop reading for a moment because the implication felt almost surreal. An extinct species of human, one we only discovered in the last few years, is still helping modern people breathe today. That realization alone changes the emotional meaning of extinction because extinction suddenly no longer feels final. It becomes layered, biological, intimate, a vanished people still living quietly inside the physiology of modern humans. And then the story became even stranger. In 2019, researchers analyzed a fossil jawbone discovered decades earlier by a Buddhist monk in a cave on the Tibetan plateau. The jawbone had sat quietly in a university collection for years, without anyone fully understanding what it was. No dramatic discovery, no famous announcement, just another mysterious fossil waiting in silence. But modern protein analysis eventually revealed the truth. The jawbone belonged to a Denisovan. It was more than 160,000 years old, which means Denisovans were living at extreme altitudes on the Tibetan plateau long before modern humans ever arrived there. Try to picture that world for a moment. Ice winds moving across barren mountain landscapes, ancient Denisovan groups surviving where oxygen levels are so low that most humans today would struggle even to walk. They adapted there, evolved there, lived generation after generation upon the roof of the world. And tens of thousands of years later, when Homo sapiens entered Asia and encountered Denisovan populations, something extraordinary happened. We inherited part of their survival toolkit. Through interbreeding, the EPAS1 gene passed into modern human populations, eventually reaching the ancestors of modern Tibetans, a gift from another species, carried invisibly through bloodlines across unimaginable spans of time. I think that is one of the most beautiful and haunting ideas in all of human evolution because it reveals that the relationship between ancient humans was not simply conflict, not simply replacement, but inheritance, cooperation across time. The Denisovans learned how to survive one of the harshest environments on Earth, and even after their species disappeared, their knowledge remained encoded inside DNA, waiting to help another kind of human survive the same mountains. There is something deeply poetic about that. Sometimes when I think about evolution, I imagine it as ruthless competition, species replacing species, survival belonging only to the strongest. But moments like this complicate that picture completely, because modern humanity did not conquer the world entirely alone. We carry adaptations, resistances, biological memories inherited from ancient cousins who solved environmental challenges long before we arrived. In a very literal sense, some modern humans can survive high altitudes today because another species once lived and adapted there first. The dead are still helping the living breathe. And honestly, I cannot think about that without feeling a strange sense of connection to these vanished people. Denisovans are often described as mysterious because we know so little about them. We do not know their faces clearly, their languages, their rituals, their stories, yet somehow, through genetics, they remain startlingly close to us, closer than many extinct species whose skeletons fill museum halls. Because Denisovans are not only fossils, they are biological ancestors still participating in the present tense of human life. Every Tibetan child born with that inherited adaptation, every breath taken at high altitude without suffering, carries a silent legacy from another human species that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. And perhaps this is what moves me most about the entire Denisovan story. It forces us to reconsider what extinction truly means. We usually imagine extinction as total absence, complete disappearance. But Denisovans challenge that idea. Their cities are gone. If they ever had cities, their voices lost, their cultures erased. Yet some part of their existence still shapes the living world every single day, hidden inside lungs, blood, cells, breathing quietly beneath the surface of modern humanity. And maybe that is the deepest truth hidden inside all of this. The boundary between past and present, between extinct and alive, is far thinner than we once believed. Because somewhere high above the earth, where the air grows thin and cold, modern humans are still surviving with the help of ghosts. There is something almost dreamlike about the forgotten islands of Southeast Asia, dense jungles surrounded by endless ocean, volcanic mountains rising through mist, caves hidden beneath thick forests where strange human stories remained buried for tens of thousands of years. And among all the discoveries in human evolution, few feel stranger to me than the tiny humans who once lived there, because they challenge one of the deepest assumptions we still carry about intelligence itself, the assumption that bigger brains automatically mean greater minds. For generations, scientists believed human evolution followed a simple pattern: larger brains, greater intelligence, more sophistication, a straight upward climb toward modern humanity. But the islands told a different story. In 2003, archaeologists excavating Liang Bua Cave on the Indonesian island of Flores uncovered the remains of a tiny adult female hominin. At first, researchers could hardly believe what they were seeing. She stood barely 1 meter tall, about the height of a small child, and her brain was astonishingly small, roughly comparable in size to that of a chimpanzee. The discovery was so unexpected, so difficult to fit into existing models of human evolution, that many scientists initially resisted it. Some argued the skeleton belonged to a diseased modern human. Others proposed developmental disorders because, honestly, the alternative sounded almost impossible. A separate species of tiny humans surviving until relatively recent prehistory. But the evidence kept accumulating. Additional remains were discovered, not one individual, but multiple individuals of the same species, eventually named Homo floresiensis, though the media quickly gave them another name, the hobbits. And honestly, I understand why the public became fascinated by them, because they sound almost mythological. Tiny humans living on isolated islands surrounded by giant reptiles and dwarf elephants, surviving in caves while modern humans spread across the world. It feels less like science and more like forgotten folklore, suddenly proven real. But what truly fascinates me is not their appearance, it is what they were capable of. Because despite their small brains, Homo floresiensis made stone tools sophisticated enough to require planning and coordination. They hunted dwarf elephants known as stegodons, animals far larger than themselves, using cooperative strategies that imply communication, social organization, perhaps even shared knowledge passed between generations. Think about how strange that is. A creature with a brain far smaller than ours, carrying out behaviors we associate with intelligence, strategy, adaptation. Suddenly, the old equation, bigger brain equals smarter mind, begins to collapse. And maybe that is one of the most important lessons hidden inside this story. Human cognition may be far more mysterious than we once believed. Intelligence is not simply size, not merely volume measured in cubic centimeters. Perhaps the architecture of the brain matters more. Perhaps social learning, adaptation, memory, emotion, uh, all combine in ways we still barely understand. Homo floresiensis survived on Flores for tens or perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, isolated by ocean barriers that prevented easy contact with the outside world. Over immense stretches of time, their ancestors likely underwent island dwarfism, a phenomenon seen in many island species where limited resources favor smaller body size. Giant elephants become miniature, predators shrink, ecosystems transform in strange evolutionary directions, and somehow humans did too. There is something profoundly haunting about imagining those island worlds, tiny humans moving through dense forests beneath tropical rain, making tools beside fires while giant lizards move through the undergrowth nearby, entire branches of humanity evolving separately in isolation, shaped not by civilization, but by the logic of islands. Then, in 2019, another astonishing discovery emerged from the Philippines: Homo luzonensis, another small bodied human species discovered inside Calao Cave on the island of Luzon. Once again, the fossils displayed an unusual combination of primitive and modern features, enough to identify them as a distinct branch of humanity. Another island, another forgotten species, another reminder that human evolution was never simple. The more scientists explored Southeast Asia, the more the region began to resemble a lost archipelago of human diversity, multiple species surviving simultaneously across isolated islands, adapting in strange and unexpected ways. And honestly, I find that idea emotionally overwhelming sometimes because it means the ancient world was far stranger than we were ever taught. Not a single human species spreading neatly across empty landscapes, but a tangled mosaic of different human forms, different minds, different evolutionary experiments unfolding side by side. Somewhere 40 or 50,000 years ago, a modern human sailing through island chains in Southeast Asia might have encountered beings no taller than children, beings whose faces looked partly familiar, partly alien, another kind of humanity surviving at the edges of the known world. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is that we still do not fully understand how intelligent they truly were, because our definitions of intelligence are often shaped by ourselves, by our technologies, our civilizations, our assumptions. But Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis remind us that evolution does not move toward a single ideal form. It produces diversity, adaptation, unexpected solutions. A small brain does not necessarily mean a simple mind. And maybe there is something humbling in that realization, because modern humans often treat themselves as the inevitable endpoint of intelligence. Yet hidden on forgotten islands, other kinds of humans solve the problem of survival in ways completely different from us. They lived, adapted, hunted, endured, and then vanished almost without trace, leaving behind only scattered bones, stone tools, and one lingering question: how many other forms of human consciousness once existed on this earth before silence swallowed them forever? There are some discoveries in human evolution that feel surprising And then there are discoveries that feel almost impossible, discoveries so strange that they force us to reconsider assumptions we did not even realize we carried. And for me, Homo naledi belongs completely in that second category, because the more I learned about this species, the more I began to feel something deeply unsettling. Not fear exactly, but the growing suspicion that we may not actually understand consciousness nearly as well as we think we do. The story begins in South Africa inside a cave system known as Rising Star, a maze of narrow underground passages hidden within the cradle of humankind, one of the richest paleoanthropological regions on Earth. In 2013, explorers crawling through the cave system discovered something extraordinary. Deep inside a chamber later called the Dinaledi Chamber, there were bones, enormous numbers of bones scattered across the darkness. Eventually, researchers recovered the remains of at least 15 individuals belonging to a previously unknown species of human, Homo naledi. And honestly, the species should not exist, at least not according to the neat evolutionary story many of us inherited, because Homo naledi looked primitive in ways that immediately confused scientists. Their bodies were relatively small, their shoulders adapted partly for climbing, their fingers curved, and most striking of all, their brains were tiny, astonishingly tiny, roughly 400 to 600 cubic centimeters, barely larger than those of chimpanzees, much smaller than Neanderthals, much smaller than Homo sapiens, much smaller than the brain sizes we traditionally associate with advanced cognition. And yet, when researchers dated the remains, the results shocked the scientific world. Homo naledi was not ancient in the way everyone expected. They were not creatures from 2 million years ago lingering at the dawn of humanity. They lived between roughly 235,000 and 335,000 years ago. At the same time, early Homo sapiens already existed in Africa. At roughly the same time, Neanderthals thrived in Europe. Imagine that for a moment. A tiny-brained species, physically primitive in many ways, surviving alongside humans who already possessed large brains and increasingly sophisticated behaviors. It felt almost like discovering a forgotten branch of evolution that somehow refused to disappear. But the real mystery was not their anatomy, it was the cave itself. Because the Dinaledi chamber is extraordinarily difficult to reach, even modern researchers had trouble accessing it. The passageways are so narrow that excavation teams had to recruit small-bodied cavers capable of squeezing through openings barely wider than the human chest. There were no signs that large predators dragged bodies there. No evidence of flooding carrying remains into the chamber. No signs of habitation. No ordinary explanation for why so many bodies accumulated deep inside this isolated underground space, which led researchers toward a possibility that still feels almost surreal. Homo naledi may have deliberately placed their dead inside the cave. In other words, a species with a brain barely larger than a chimpanzee's may have practiced mortuary behavior. They may have returned repeatedly into darkness to dispose of bodies intentionally. And I remember the exact feeling I had when I first encountered that idea, because something inside me resisted it instinctively. Not because the evidence was weak, but because it challenged a belief I did not realize I still held. The belief that symbolic or ritual behavior requires a large human-like brain. We like to imagine consciousness as a ladder, bigger brains leading inevitably toward deeper thought, more emotion, more meaning. But Homo naledi refuses to fit that model, because if they truly buried their dead, then some form of abstract thought, memory, social attachment, perhaps even ritual, existed inside minds we would once have dismissed as too primitive for such things, and then the story became even stranger. In recent years, researchers reported possible engravings discovered on cave walls inside the Rising Star system, geometric patterns, lines, shapes, markings that may have been intentionally created by Homo naledi. If confirmed, these engravings could represent some of the oldest known symbolic markings made by any human species. Not by Homo sapiens, not by Neanderthals, but by a small-brained species we barely understand. And honestly, That possibility has haunted me ever since, because it raises a terrifyingly beautiful question. What if consciousness is not what we think it is? What if symbolic thought, ritual, emotional depth, the desire to leave marks behind, emerged in multiple forms across different branches of humanity? We often define intelligence according to ourselves, language, technology, cities, writing, but perhaps awareness is more ancient, and more widespread, more mysterious than our models can currently explain. Sometimes I try to imagine Homo naledi descending into those caves, carrying bodies through darkness illuminated only by flickering firelight, moving quietly through narrow stone passages toward hidden chambers deep beneath the earth. Why did they do it? Grief? Ritual? Fear of death? Respect for the dead? We do not know, and perhaps we never will. But the act itself suggests something profoundly emotional, something difficult to reduce to mere instinct. And the more I think about that, the more uncertain the boundary between modern and primitive begins to feel. Because perhaps human consciousness was never a single sudden revolution. Perhaps it emerged gradually, unevenly, across many different species, many different minds, all experimenting with awareness in their own ways. And maybe that is the most unsettling possibility of all, that intelligence, emotion, symbolism, even spirituality are not uniquely ours, but echoes of something much older, something woven deeply into the human family tree long before Homo sapiens ever appeared. By the time I finished reading about Homo naledi, I realized something uncomfortable. I no longer felt certain that we truly understand what consciousness is. Because somewhere in the darkness of a South African cave, a small-brained species left behind evidence that they may have mourned, remembered, and perhaps even wondered about death itself. And if that is true, then the ancient world was filled not simply with different human bodies, but with different forms of awareness, different ways of experiencing existence, all now gone silent, leaving only bones, shadows, and questions behind. There is one story in all of paleoanthropology that unsettles me more than almost any other. Not because it is the oldest or the most dramatic, but because it happened so recently, so unbelievably recently, that it begins to blur the line between prehistory and memory. It is the story of the Red Deer Cave people, a mysterious population discovered in southern China, beings who may have belonged to a completely different branch of humanity, and who might have survived until just 14,000 years ago. 14,000. That number alone is difficult to process, because 14,000 years ago is not some unimaginable abyss of deep time. It is close enough that human civilization was already beginning to stir elsewhere on Earth. Agriculture was emerging in the Fertile Crescent. Humans were crossing oceans. Communities were forming. Stories were being passed down around fires in recognizable human languages. And somewhere in southern China, another kind of human may still have been alive. The discovery began in caves in Yunnan province, especially a site known as Maludong, Red Deer Cave, named after the giant red deer hunted there by its ancient inhabitants. Archaeologists excavating the site uncovered bones, many bones mixed with charcoal, burned animal remains, and evidence of food processing. Whoever lived there used fire, cooked meat, cracked bones to extract marrow, behaviors completely familiar to modern human archaeology. At first glance, nothing seemed especially unusual, but then researchers examined the human remains more closely, and the story became deeply strange. The skulls did not fully resemble modern Homo sapiens. Their features appeared archaic, primitive in ways that should not have existed so recently. The skull bones were thick, the brow ridges pronounced, the foreheads angled differently from modern humans. Some traits resembled ancient hominin populations separated from us by hundreds of thousands of years, yet the dating results remained clear. These individuals lived between approximately 11,000 and 14,000 years ago. And honestly, the first time I truly understood the timeline, I felt something close to vertigo, because 14,000 years ago, the pyramids were still thousands of years in the future. The first cities had not yet appeared. And Human history, as we usually imagine it, was only beginning. And yet, another kind of human being may still have been walking the earth beside us. Not 50,000 years ago, not 100,000, but close enough that if oral traditions survived long enough, some memory of them might once have existed in human stories. That possibility honestly chills me because it transforms the ancient world into something much stranger and more crowded than I ever imagined. We often picture prehistory as a lonely stage occupied only by Homo sapiens, but the Red Deer Cave people suggest something profoundly different. They suggest that long after we believed all other human species had disappeared, isolated populations may still have survived quietly in remote refuges, hidden among forests and mountains while modern humans expanded across the globe. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is that researchers still do not know exactly what the Red Deer Cave people were. Some scientists argue they may represent an unusually archaic population of Homo sapiens. Others suggest they could belong to a separate lineage descended from much older human groups, perhaps a remnant population isolated for tens of thousands of years. The evidence remains uncertain, ambiguous, unresolved, and somehow that uncertainty makes the story even more haunting. Because there is something deeply eerie about the possibility that another human species existed almost within reach of recorded history. Imagine it. Somewhere in southern China, hunters with unfamiliar faces gathered around fires while the earliest agricultural societies emerged elsewhere in the world. Another kind of human consciousness surviving quietly at the edge of civilization, unnoticed, undocumented, eventually disappearing without leaving a written trace. I keep trying to imagine what encounters between them and modern humans might have looked like. Did they trade? Did they avoid each other? Did they fear one another? Or perhaps, most unsettling of all, did they recognize something familiar in each other? Because by 14,000 years ago, Homo sapiens already possessed complex language, rituals, social structures. But if the Red Deer Cave people truly represented another lineage, then the boundary between us and them must have felt astonishingly thin, close enough to see humanity in each other, distant enough to feel strange. Sometimes I think about how many stories vanished forever because nobody wrote them down, entire peoples disappearing before history began recording names, entire human experiences erased except for scattered bones buried beneath caves. The Red Deer Cave. People feel like one of those lost stories, a final whisper from a world where multiple kinds of humans may still have existed side by side. And perhaps that is why this discovery affects me so deeply, because it changes the emotional scale of extinction. Extinction no longer feels ancient and distant. It feels recent, intimate, almost within reach. The last non-sapiens humans may not have vanished in some remote prehistoric age beyond comprehension. They may have lived close enough to civilization that somewhere long ago, modern humans looked directly into their eyes. And the deeper I think about that possibility, the harder it becomes to feel certain about the neat boundaries we draw around our own species. Because perhaps human history was never a clean story of one humanity inheriting the earth. Perhaps it was a long twilight filled with encounters, overlaps, disappearances, and forgotten people surviving quietly at the edges of the known world until silence finally took them too. Sometimes late at night, when I think about the Red Deer Cave people, I stop thinking like a scientist and start imagining them as living beings, real people moving through forests and valleys while the ancient world slowly transformed around them. And honestly, I think this may be the part of the entire story that affects me most deeply because it forces me to confront a question I cannot answer. Um, what would it actually feel like to meet another kind of human mind? Not an animal, not a mythological creature, not an alien from another planet, but another human, close enough to recognize yourself in them, different enough to know they are not entirely like you. Imagine it for a moment. Southern China, 14,000 years ago, mist drifting between trees, smoke rising from a distant fire. A small group of Homo sapiens hunters moving carefully through unfamiliar terrain. Then suddenly, movement ahead, figures standing near the edge of the forest. Human, but strange. Their faces shaped differently, their movements slightly unfamiliar, perhaps their voices carrying sounds unlike any language you know. And for one suspended moment, both groups simply stare at each other. I cannot stop wondering what they felt in that moment. Fear, curiosity, recognition. Because there must have been something profoundly unsettling about encountering another kind of person, another intelligence occupying the same world. Did they immediately understand each other as human? Or did they experience something stranger, something difficult even to describe? We modern humans have never truly experienced this. We live in a world where Homo sapiens is alone. Every face we encounter belongs to the same species. But for most of human evolutionary history, that was not true. Another kind of human consciousness existed somewhere nearby, sometimes different in body, perhaps different in thought, and yet close enough that the boundaries between us and them became emotionally unstable. I imagine the first attempts at communication, gestures, cautious movements, offerings of food, perhaps silence around a shared fire. Maybe they exchanged tools, maybe they observed each other from a distance for days before approaching. Maybe children were less afraid than adults. Sometimes I wonder if they laughed at the same things, if expressions crossed the species boundary easily, if grief looked familiar, if affection did. And then there is another possibility, one even more intimate. Even more intimate. Did they fall in love? We know Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Modern genetics proves that beyond doubt. So somewhere in the ancient world, different human species formed bonds strong enough to create families. Think about how extraordinary that is. Two kinds of human beings, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, looking into each other's eyes and seeing not only difference, but attraction, closeness, perhaps tenderness. I honestly cannot think about that without feeling overwhelmed by it, because it means human connection may be deeper and stranger than we ever imagined. Somewhere tens of thousands of years ago, a child may have been born carrying the blended inheritance of two human worlds, and perhaps nobody alive today even knows their name. Sometimes I imagine a Homo sapiens traveler entering a valley occupied by Red Deer cave people, seeing smoke in the distance, hearing unfamiliar voices carried by the wind, feeling both fear and fascination. Maybe they approached cautiously, maybe they traded meat, stone tools, shells, pigments. Maybe there were violent encounters too, territory disputes, suspicion, conflict. Human history has always contained both fear and curiosity toward difference. But I cannot shake the feeling that some encounters must have been peaceful, because otherwise, none of the genetic evidence we see today would exist. And what haunts me most is this: we will never know how those other human minds experience the world. We can analyze bones, genomes, tools, but consciousness leaves no fossils, right? Did Red Deer cave people dream the way we do? Did they tell stories around fires? Did they stare at stars and wonder what existed beyond them? Did they experience loneliness, love, awe? We have no way of knowing, and perhaps that mystery is permanent. But maybe the most important realization is not that they were exactly like us. It is that they did not need to be exactly like us to matter. Because for most of modern history, humans have imagined intelligence as singular, one correct form, our form. Yet the ancient world may have contained multiple ways of being conscious, multiple ways of interpreting existence, different minds walking beneath the same moon, and then almost all of them disappeared. Sometimes I think modern humanity carries a kind of evolutionary loneliness we barely recognize, because we evolved in a world filled with neighboring human species, and now, suddenly there's only us. The silence left behind by those vanished minds may be far older and deeper than civilization itself. And perhaps that is why stories like the Red Deer Cave people feel so emotionally powerful, because they remind us that humanity was once far more diverse, more mysterious, more crowded than we ever imagined. Somewhere in the deep past, another kind of human being looked across a fire at our ancestors, and for one brief moment, two different human worlds shared the same darkness together. Then time erased almost everything, except the questions. The questions remain, waiting quietly in caves, in bones, in DNA, and maybe most of all, inside us. The more I explore the ancient human world, the more one realization keeps returning to me again and again, a realization so simple and yet so emotionally difficult to fully absorb. For almost all of human history, we were never alone, not metaphorically, literally. Somewhere beyond the next valley, the next mountain range, the next river system, there was often another kind of human being alive on this planet, another intelligence, another way of thinking, another pair of eyes looking out across the same world. And honestly, I do not think modern humans fully understand how strange that truly is, because we were born into a world of singular humanity. Every person we meet, every face we recognize belongs to Homo sapiens. We argue with each other, divide ourselves into nations and religions and cultures, but biologically, we are one surviving branch, they say, one remaining human species. We assume this is normal because it is all we have ever known. But evolution tells a different story. For hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years, the Earth contained multiple human species at once. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans across Asia, Homo floresiensis on isolated islands, Homo naledi in Africa, mysterious populations we may never fully identify, all living simultaneously during overlapping windows of time. Imagine what that means psychologically. Imagine growing up in a world where human did not mean one thing, where encountering another kind of intelligence was part of reality itself. Somewhere beyond familiar territory, another kind of person existed, close enough to recognize, different enough to unsettle you. I think modern humans underestimate how deeply that reality may have shaped us because our brains, our emotions, our instincts evolved inside that crowded world, not this lonely one. We evolved while sharing landscapes with neighboring human species, competing with them, fearing them, learning from them, perhaps loving them. For most of our evolutionary story, another kind of human mind was always somewhere nearby, and then suddenly they were gone. Sometimes I wonder if the loneliness modern humans feel today, the strange existential isolation running through philosophy, religion, literature, even science fiction, is partly an echo of that disappearance. Because maybe our species evolved expecting plurality, um, expecting other intelligences that looked almost like us but not entirely. And now, for the first time in evolutionary history, the, we inhabit the world alone. There is something haunting about that thought, because it means the silence surrounding modern humanity may actually be unnatural. I remember standing once in a crowded city late at night, thousands of people moving beneath lights and glass towers, and suddenly realizing that every person around me belonged to the same species, the surviving lineage. And for a strange moment, the city felt almost empty, because 40,000 years ago, the world would not have looked like this. Somewhere beyond the edge of Homo sapiens territory, another kind of humanity would still have existed, another consciousness shaped by different evolutionary pressures, another intelligence interpreting reality in ways we may never understand. We tend to imagine evolution as a ladder, one species replacing another, cleanly. But the truth feels far more ecological. The ancient world was an ecosystem of minds, different human species occupying different environments, developing different survival strategies, perhaps different social structures, perhaps even different emotional worlds. And honestly, the more I think about that, the more difficult it becomes to define uh, what humanity actually is. Because maybe humanity was never singular. Maybe human was always a category containing diversity, variation, multiple forms of consciousness existing side by side. When Neanderthals painted caves, when Denisovans adapted to high mountains, when Homo floresiensis hunted dwarf elephants on isolated islands, they were each expressing different solutions to the problem of existence, different ways of being alive in the world. And now, almost all of those perspectives are gone forever. Entire modes of perception erased. Entire emotional realities vanished before history could preserve them. Sometimes I try to imagine how the Earth itself must have felt during that time. Ice Age winds moving across plains where multiple human species walked beneath the same stars. Fires burning in distant caves belonging to different minds, different cultures, different ways of understanding death, beauty, survival, meaning. It almost feels impossible now because modern humanity has become so accustomed to its own singularity. But singularity is new, terrifyingly new. For nearly all of prehistory, another kind of human was always somewhere out there. And perhaps the strangest part of all is that traces of those vanished minds still remain inside us. Their genes survive, their adaptations survive, maybe even subtle influences on cognition survive. We carry fragments of extinct human worlds within our own biology, which means the separation between them and us was never complete. The diversity of minds that once walked the earth may still echo faintly inside modern humanity itself. And honestly, that thought changes the emotional meaning of being human for me, because it suggests we are not merely survivors, we are inheritors, living archives of ancient encounters. Biological mosaics shaped by relationships with other human species, now lost to time. Sometimes when I look at modern civilization, at art, philosophy, music, science, I wonder how much of what we call humanity emerged not in isolation, but in dialogue with those vanished cousins. Perhaps our species was sharpened, expanded, emotionally shaped by existing beside other intelligences for hundreds of thousands of years. And perhaps that is why the disappearance of the others feels so haunting even now. Because consciously or not, we may still be grieving a world that once contained many kinds of human minds, a world far stranger, far richer, and far less lonely than the one we inherited. The deeper scientists began exploring ancient DNA, the stranger the human story became. At first, Neanderthal genes inside modern humans sounded almost symbolic to me, an interesting detail, evidence that our ancestors once interbred with another human species. But the more researchers uncovered, the more unsettling the implications became. Because these ancient genes are not silent, they are active, influencing living bodies, shaping aspects of how modern humans experience the world right now. And honestly, that realization changed something fundamental in the way I think about identity. Because if parts of our biology still come from extinct humans, then perhaps fragments of their experience survive too. Researchers have discovered that Neanderthal DNA influences many systems within the modern human body, including the immune system, skin, metabolism, responses to environmental stress, and perhaps most haunting of all, parts of the nervous system itself. Some inherited variants affect how people experience pain, sensitivity, inflammation, even susceptibility to certain neurological conditions. In other words, traces of another human species may still shape how some of us physically feel the world. Just pause with that thought for a moment. 40 or 50,000 years ago, a Neanderthal individual looked across an ice age landscape, felt cold, hunger, injury, fear, through a nervous system shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution. And today, fragments of that same biological architecture still exist inside modern humans. The dead are not entirely dead, they echo quietly through sensation itself. I remember reading one study suggesting that certain Neanderthal gene variants influence pain sensitivity in living people, and for some reason, that detail affected me more deeply than almost anything else in this story. Because pain is intimate, immediate, profoundly personal. It is not abstract history, it is experience. And suddenly, I found myself wondering something almost impossible to answer. If a person today experiences physical sensation partly through inherited Neanderthal genetics, then in some tiny way, are we still feeling the world through them? Not metaphorically, biologically. The immune system tells a similarly strange story. Many Neanderthal genes appear to have helped Homo sapiens adapt when our ancestors migrated into unfamiliar environments outside Africa. They carried immune defenses shaped by hundreds of thousands of years, surviving in Eurasia, defenses against local pathogens, climates, ecological pressures. Through interbreeding, modern humans inherited some of those adaptations, and those ancient inheritances still influence disease responses today. In fact, during the COVID-19 pandemic, researchers discovered that certain Neanderthal-derived genetic variants were associated with increased risk of severe illness, while others appeared protective. Imagine the strangeness of that. A virus emerging in the 21st century interacting with genetic material inherited from an extinct species tens of thousands of years ago. Human history folding back on itself across unimaginable spans of time. But perhaps what unsettles me most is the possibility that Neanderthal DNA influences not only the body, but aspects of perception itself. Some studies suggest ancient variants may shape sleep patterns, mood regulation, nicotine addiction, neurological responses, perhaps even behavioral tendencies. The science is still evolving, much remains uncertain, yet the broader implication is impossible to ignore. Modern humans are not biologically pure Homo sapiens. We are hybrids, mosaics, collections of inherited adaptations drawn from multiple branches of ancient humanity. And honestly, the more I think about that, the more unstable the idea of a singular human identity begins to feel. Because maybe consciousness itself is not entirely Homo sapiens. Maybe the modern mind emerged from the blending of multiple human lineages, multiple evolutionary experiments layered together inside one species. Sometimes I imagine the ancient encounters that made this possible. Homo sapiens meeting Neanderthals somewhere beneath Ice Age skies, forming relationships, creating families, unaware that fragments of their shared biology would survive tens of thousands of years into the future. They could never have imagined genetic sequencing, neuroscience, modern medicine, yet their choices still echo invisibly through billions of living people today. There is something profoundly moving about that, because it transforms evolution from a story of replacement into a story of inheritance. Not conquest alone, but absorption, continuity, memory carried inside flesh. And perhaps this is the strangest realization of all. When we think, when we feel pain, when our immune systems respond to disease, when our nervous systems interpret the world, some small part of those processes may arise from evolutionary pathways shaped not only by Homo sapiens, but by other human species now gone. Other minds, other lives, other ways of existing, surviving invisibly inside us. I think modern civilization still struggles emotionally with this idea because we want identity to feel singular, clean, self-contained. We want to believe human means one lineage, one uninterrupted story. But ancient DNA has shattered that illusion. The human mind may not belong entirely to one species. It may be the product of many ancient inheritances layered together across deep time. And honestly, I find that both beautiful and unsettling, because it means the boundaries between past and present, extinct and alive, self and ancestor, are far thinner than we once imagined. Somewhere inside modern humanity, echoes of vanished worlds are still speaking quietly through biology, through sensation, through instinct, through the invisible architecture of the nervous system itself. And perhaps that is why the deeper I go into this story, the harder it becomes to think of consciousness as something singular, because maybe none of us are thinking entirely alone. Maybe every human mind alive today is partly a chorus, shaped by the surviving fragments of multiple ancient humanities speaking together across time. Maybe, in ways we are only beginning to understand, we still think with many ancient brains at once. About 74,000 years ago, long before cities, long before language took written form, long before the names of nations or gods or civilizations, the earth itself nearly ended the human story, right? And honestly, the more I learned about the Toba eruption, the more fragile humanity began to feel to me. Because we often imagine our species as inevitable, destined somehow to inherit the planet. But evolution does not guarantee survival. History could have ended before it truly began. The eruption occurred at Lake Toba in present-day Indonesia, where a supervolcano exploded with a force almost impossible to comprehend. Not a normal volcanic eruption, not even close. This was one of the eruptions in the last 2 million years. A catastrophe so immense that ash spread across huge portions of Asia, darkening skies, poisoning ecosystems, altering climates far beyond the eruption site itself. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath layers of volcanic debris. Sunlight weakened, temperatures may have fallen dramatically, forests collapsed, food chains shattered, and somewhere within that collapsing world, early Homo sapiens were trying desperately to survive. I remember the first time I truly grasped the scale of the event, because until then, ancient humanity had still felt strangely secure in my imagination, vulnerable perhaps, but steadily advancing. Then suddenly, the Toba hypothesis introduced something terrifying, the possibility that our species came dangerously close to disappearing altogether. Some genetic evidence suggests that after the eruption, the global population of Homo sapiens may have dropped catastrophically, perhaps to only a few thousand breeding individuals, maybe even fewer. Think about that for a moment. Every human being alive today, every city, every empire, every language, every piece of music, every scientific discovery, every child who will ever be born may descend from a population small enough to fit inside a modern stadium. It almost feels impossible, the entire future of humanity hanging by a thread during a volcanic winter, tens of thousands of years ago. Of course, scientists still debate aspects of the Toba bottleneck theory. Some argue the environmental effects may not have been equally devastating everywhere. Others question how severe the population collapse truly became. But regardless of the precise numbers, one truth remains unavoidable. Homo sapiens survived through periods of unimaginable vulnerability. Our species was never guaranteed success. And honestly, I think modern civilization forgets that. We look backward through history as though our dominance was inevitable. But the deeper I explore human evolution, the more accidental everything begins to feel. Because while Homo sapiens struggled through climate disasters and population bottlenecks, other human species were still alive too. Neanderthals, Denisovans, perhaps populations we have not even discovered yet. The ancient world was not waiting for us to inherit it. It was already inhabited, already populated by multiple kinds of human beings trying to survive the same brutal planet. Sometimes I try to imagine what the Toba world must have looked like. Ash falling silently across forests, rivers darkened, animals disappearing, small groups of humans huddled beside weak fires while the climate shifted around them. Hunger, uncertainty. Entire generations born into environmental collapse, and somewhere within that chaos, our species almost vanished. Not defeated in battle, not replaced by superior rivals, simply overwhelmed by nature itself. There is something strangely humbling about that realization, because it means modern humanity exists not only because of intelligence or adaptation, but because some small groups endured catastrophe by the narrowest possible margin. Somewhere in Africa, perhaps along coastlines rich in marine food, perhaps within isolated refuges protected from the worst environmental effects, tiny populations survived while countless others disappeared, and every human being alive today carries the inheritance of those survivors. I think this is one of the reasons the human story feels so emotionally powerful to me, because beneath all our technology and civilizations, we are descendants of near extinction, descendants of frightened groups who survived long enough to pass life forward one more generation, one more child, one more winter. Sometimes when I think about the Toba bottleneck, I imagine how differently history could have unfolded. If conditions had grown slightly harsher, if survival groups had failed, if climate collapse had lasted longer, Homo sapiens might simply have disappeared. Another extinct branch in the fossil record, another lost species buried beneath time. No cities, no pyramids, no music, no philosophy, no modern world, only silence. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is that if Homo sapiens had vanished, the Earth would not have become empty. Uh, Other human species would still have remained. Neanderthals might have continued evolving across Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans across Asia. Entirely different civilizations and histories could have emerged from branches of humanity now lost to us. The modern world as we know it was never inevitable. It was only one possible outcome among many. And honestly, that realization changes the emotional meaning of survival itself. Because we often speak about human success as though it proves superiority. But maybe survival is not proof of destiny. Maybe it is partly chance, resilience, adaptation, and timing. Maybe Homo sapiens survived not because we were chosen, but because enough of us endured catastrophe long enough to continue the story. The Toba eruption reminds us that the human species is not invincible, never was. We came frighteningly close to disappearing before civilization even began, and perhaps somewhere deep inside us, some ancient memory of that fragility still remains. A buried awareness that humanity once stood at the edge of extinction, staring into darkness, almost lost forever. For a long time, I assumed Homo sapiens must have defeated the other human species through some obvious superiority, greater strength, greater intelligence, better tools, something dramatic enough to explain why only one branch of humanity survived while all the others disappeared. But the deeper I explored the evidence, the more unsettling the truth became. Because Homo sapiens may not have been overwhelmingly better than Neanderthals or Denisovans, not physically, not even cognitively, in the simplistic way we often imagine. In many ways, the differences appear surprisingly small, and yet those small differences change the fate of the world. This is where many researchers begin speaking about what is sometimes called the cognitive revolution, a shift in human behavior that transformed Homo sapiens from one human species among many into the dominant force on the planet. But honestly, I think the phrase itself can sound misleading because it creates the impression of a sudden explosion of genius, a dramatic moment when modern humans suddenly became smarter than everyone else. Uh, the reality may have been quieter, slower, more subtle. Homo sapiens were not necessarily stronger than Neanderthals. In fact, Neanderthals were probably physically more powerful. Their bodies were dense, muscular, adapted for Ice Age survival in ways modern humans were not. Nor is there clear evidence that Homo sapiens possessed radically larger brains. The difference may not have been raw intelligence at all, but something more fragile, more social, the ability to cooperate at larger scales. The more I think about this, the more profound it seems, because perhaps the defining trait of Homo sapiens was not individual brilliance, but collective imagination. Language likely played an enormous role, not just communication in the simple sense, but symbolic language, the ability to share abstract ideas, myths, plans, identities. Imagine the difference between saying there are animals beyond the hill and saying, tomorrow we will move together across the valley because the spirits favor this route and our people belong to the same story. One is information, the other is shared meaning. And shared meaning changes everything. Because once large groups of humans believe the same stories, they can cooperate far beyond immediate family ties. They can organize, exchange knowledge, maintain alliances across huge territories, trust strangers connected through symbols and myths. I sometimes wonder if this was the true evolutionary advantage of Homo sapiens, not sharper minds individually, but the ability to connect minds together into something larger. Neanderthals may have lived in relatively small groups, tightly bonded, emotionally rich, deeply adapted to local environments, but Homo sapiens appear to have built broader social networks, trade routes stretching across regions, symbolic identities shared between distant communities, innovations spreading more rapidly from group to group. And once again, the difference may have been slight, frustratingly slight, not a dramatic leap, just enough to matter over thousands of years. A slightly faster exchange of ideas, a slightly larger alliance, a slightly more flexible response to environmental change. Over immense stretches of time, those tiny advantages compound. They accumulate generation after generation until eventually one species begins expanding faster than the others. I find something deeply humbling in that, because it means Homo sapiens may not have survived because we were inherently superior. We may have survived because we became slightly better at becoming more than individuals, uh, slightly better at turning separate minds into collective systems. And honestly, that realization feels strangely relevant even now. Modern civilization itself still operates on the same principle. No individual human understands everything required to sustain the modern world. We survive through networks, shared symbols, cooperation between strangers, inherited knowledge passed across generations. In many ways, the cognitive revolution never ended. It simply expanded until billions of people became connected through stories, institutions, technologies, identities. But there is another part of this that haunts me, because symbolic thought does not only create cooperation, it creates imagination, religion, art, memory, the ability to carry invisible worlds inside the mind. Somewhere in prehistory, Homo sapiens began treating symbols as real enough to organize entire communities around them. Flags, myths, ancestors, nations, gods, money, laws. All of these things exist because human beings can collectively believe in abstractions. And perhaps that ability gave our species extraordinary flexibility. We could adapt rapidly because information no longer depended entirely on instinct or local experience. Ideas could spread faster than genes, faster than evolution itself. Sometimes I imagine small groups of Homo sapiens moving across Ice Age landscapes, carrying not only tools, but stories. Stories about where food could be found, stories about enemies, stories about ancestors, stories about the meaning of existence itself. Those stories linked minds together into networks larger than any single individual could survive alone. And maybe that is why Homo sapiens eventually expanded across the planet while other human species faded away. Not because we were dramatically more intelligent, but because we became slightly better at sharing thought itself, slightly better at turning many fragile human minds into one collective intelligence. And perhaps that is the strangest irony of all. The species that survived may not have been the strongest, or even the smartest in every individual sense. We may simply have been the species most capable of cooperation, the species most able to imagine shared realities together. And from that small evolutionary advantage, cities, civilizations, science, religion, empires, and the entire modern world eventually emerged, all because somewhere in the deep past, Homo sapiens learned how to connect minds together more effectively than any other human species on Earth. For most of the 20th century, the story of modern human origins seemed relatively clear. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, expanded outward into the rest of the world, and eventually replaced all other human species. Cleanly, completely, almost like a tide washing older populations away. This idea became known as the out of Africa model, and for a long time it dominated anthropology. There was something emotionally satisfying about it. One species emerging, conquering the planet, inheriting the earth alone. But the deeper ancient DNA research progressed, the more that clean narrative began to collapse. And honestly, I think this collapse may be one of the most important scientific revolutions of our time, because it did not merely change a few details about prehistory, it fundamentally changed what it means to be human. At first, the cracks appeared slowly: Neanderthal DNA discovered inside modern humans, Denisovan ancestry hidden across Asia and Oceania, evidence of repeated interbreeding events. The old model could no longer survive unchanged. Homo sapiens had not remained genetically isolated while spreading across the world. We encountered other human species, and we had children with them, again and again. The boundaries between ancient human groups were far more porous than anyone had imagined. But then came one discovery that still feels almost unbelievable to me. In 2018, scientists analyzing a tiny bone fragment from Denisova cave identified a teenage girl who lived roughly 90,000 years ago. Her nickname became Denny, and what researchers uncovered inside her DNA completely shattered traditional ideas about human species. Denny's mother was Neanderthal, her father was Denisovan, not a distant mixed ancestry, not ancient traces diluted across thousands of generations. Direct parents, a first generation hybrid, a child born from two different human species. And honestly, when I first learned this, I felt as though the entire human story suddenly became unstable beneath my feet. Because Denny forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable. What exactly is a species? We often imagine species as separate boxes, clean biological categories divided by absolute boundaries. But nature rarely works that way, especially not in human evolution. If Neanderthals and Denisovans could produce viable children together, and if Homo sapiens could interbreed with both, then perhaps these ancient humans were less like isolated species and more like neighboring populations spread across a gradient of variation different, but not entirely separate. And the more I think about that, the stranger humanity becomes. Because maybe the ancient world was not divided into rigid categories of us and them. Maybe it was filled with overlapping human lineages, populations meeting, separating, merging again, exchanging genes, technologies, perhaps even stories. Over immense spans of time, evolution suddenly feels less like a branching tree and more like rivers constantly splitting and reconnecting. Sometimes I imagine Denisova Cave 90,000 years ago, fires burning inside the darkness, Neanderthals moving through one generation, Denisovans through another, encounters occurring again and again across centuries. And among them, Denny, a child who embodied two ancient human worlds at once. What language did she hear growing up? Did her parents recognize themselves as different peoples? Did those differences matter emotionally, socially, culturally? We will never know, but the fact that she existed at all changes everything. Because Denny proves that the ancient human world was not only conflict and replacement, it was intimacy, family, blending. The old replacement narrative begins to feel painfully incomplete once you truly absorb that. Homo sapiens did not simply arrive and erase everyone else. We absorbed them. We carry their biology inside us, their adaptations, their immune systems, perhaps fragments of their cognition, survive within modern humanity. And honestly, I think this changes the emotional meaning of extinction itself. Extinction no longer feels absolute, because parts of these ancient populations continue living through us, not as separate species, but as inherited fragments woven into the human genome. The more scientists sequence ancient DNA, the more evidence appears that interbreeding between human groups happened repeatedly, not rarely. Multiple encounters, multiple hybrid populations, entire histories of contact we are only beginning to uncover. And suddenly, the idea of pure Homo sapiens begins to dissolve. Modern humans are not isolated from the rest of human evolution. We are the result of it, layered with ancient inheritances from multiple lineages. Sometimes I think this is why the story affects me so deeply, because it reveals something profoundly human about identity itself. We want categories to feel stable: species, nations, races, civilizations. We crave boundaries. But evolution keeps revealing a much messier truth. Life blends, adapts, absorbs, survives through mixture as often as separation. And perhaps that is the deepest irony of all. For generations, Homo sapiens imagined itself as the lone triumphant species that replaced all rivals. But the genetic evidence tells another story. We did not survive alone. We survived partly because we carried others forward with us. Fragments of Neanderthals, Denisovans, perhaps other unknown groups, still exist in living human bodies today, which means the modern human species is not a pure ending. It is a mosaic, a living archive of ancient encounters. And maybe that is the most beautiful and unsettling truth hidden inside all of this. We did not entirely replace the other humans. We became the place where they continued to exist. And so, after hundreds of thousands of years, after migrations, volcanic winters, interbreeding, extinctions, cave fires burning in forgotten valleys, after all the different human species that once shared this planet slowly faded into silence, only one remained: Homo sapiens, us, the last surviving branch of a once enormous and diverse human family. And honestly, the more I think about that, the stranger modern humanity begins to feel because we grow up imagining ourselves as the center of the human story, the inevitable ending, the species that was always meant to inherit the earth. But now, after everything we have uncovered, fossils, cave paintings, ancient DNA, buried genomes hidden inside our blood, that narrative no longer feels true to me. Humanity was never singular, never simple, never alone. For most of prehistory, the earth belonged to many kinds of humans, different bodies, different faces, perhaps different forms of thought, different ways of experiencing existence itself. Some walked frozen plains beneath ice age skies, some adapted to tropical islands, some survived high mountain plateaus where the air itself becomes hostile to life. And now almost all of them are gone. Neanderthals vanished. Denisovans disappeared into genetic shadows. Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, the red deer cave people, all silent now. Their languages lost, their songs lost, their fears, their hopes, their memories erased by time before history could preserve them. Sometimes I try to imagine the final moments of those worlds. The last Neanderthal campfire burning somewhere in Europe, the last Denisovan child falling asleep beneath mountain stars, the last forgotten human species surviving quietly in isolated valleys while Homo sapiens expanded across the earth. None of them knew they were the last. None of them understood that entire branches of humanity were disappearing forever. And perhaps that is the deepest sadness hidden inside evolution. Extinction happens quietly, not with grand endings, but with smaller populations, fewer children, fading territories, until eventually silence replaces entire worlds. But then there is the other side of the story, the part that still feels almost miraculous to me. Because although the other human species vanished as separate peoples, they did not vanish completely. Their DNA remains alive inside us. Every person alive today carries fragments of ancient humanity, Neanderthal genes influencing immunity, skin, pain perception, Denisovan genes helping Tibetan populations survive at extreme altitude, ancient inheritances still shaping living bodies tens of thousands of years after those species disappeared, which means modern humanity is not purely Homo sapiens. We are something more layered, more blended, more ancient than we once believed. We are biological mosaics, living archives of vanished worlds. And honestly, I think that realization changes the emotional meaning of being human because it means we are not standing alone at the end of evolution. We are carrying others forward with us. The dead still travel inside the living. Sometimes I return in my mind to those Neanderthal handprints deep inside caves in Spain, red pigment sprayed across stone 65,000 years ago, a hand pressed against a wall in darkness. Someone leaving behind the simplest message imaginable: I existed. And somehow, against all odds, they succeeded. Because tens of thousands of years later, we are still speaking about them, still carrying their genes, still wondering who they were. In a strange way, those ancient humans achieved the same thing every civilization hopes for. They escaped complete oblivion. I think that's why this story affects me so deeply. Because beneath all the science, beneath the fossils and genetics and timelines, it ultimately becomes a story about connection. Humanity did not emerge from isolation. We were shaped through encounters, through coexistence, through mixture, through inheritance. The modern human species is not a pure survivor standing triumphantly above extinct rivals. We are the final convergence point of many ancient human journeys. And perhaps that is why the loneliness of modern humanity feels so profound, because somewhere deep inside us, maybe we still remember, not consciously, but biologically, that the world was once filled with other human minds, other voices, other eyes looking into firelight beside us. Now, the caves are empty, the ancient campfires cold, the species gone. Only we remain, and yet they are still here too. Hidden quietly inside our blood, inside our nervous systems, inside the invisible architecture of what we became. Sometimes I wonder what those ancient humans would think if they could see us now. Cities glowing across continents, Spacecraft crossing the darkness above Earth, billions of people connected through invisible networks. Would they recognize themselves in us? Would they see fragments of their own fears, creativity, love, survival still moving through the modern world? I think perhaps would, because despite all our technology, despite civilization itself, we are still part of the same ancient human story, a story not of one species, but of many, all flowing together across deep time until eventually only one humanity remained, carrying the echoes of all the others within it. And maybe that is the final truth hidden beneath this entire journey. The 9 species of humans who walked this earth became one, and that one carries all the others inside it.